The cold on Serate Moon had a different quality than Earth's cold. It didn't just chill, it invaded, seeking the marrow of your bones with a patient malice that made death by exposure seem almost merciful. Herman Vale pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as he trudged through the settlement's only marketplace, a pathetic collection of corrugated metal stalls huddled together against the eternal winter. He hadn't meant to time his supply run with the slave auction. The settlements held them quarterly, and Herman made a point of avoiding the brutal spectacle. But his heating unit had failed 3 days earlier, and the choice was simple: brave the marketplace today or freeze by morning. The auction had just concluded. Bulk carriers were loading their merchandise, mostly off-worlders captured during border disputes or natives of distant moons seized for supposed violations of colonial authority edicts. The remains of the day's business were being cleared away, traders counting their profits, while the less fortunate captives were herded into transports bound for mines and processing plants across the system. Herman kept his eyes down. 7 years on this forsaken rock had taught him the value of invisibility. He filled his pack with the meager supplies he could afford: synthetic protein, fuel cells, a replacement heating coil, and was about to retreat to his remote cabin when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. In the shadows behind the auction platform, a figure sat motionless. At first, Herman thought it was discarded cargo, perhaps a broken crate. But as he passed, he realized it was a person, a woman. She sat with unnatural stillness, her legs folded beneath her, hands resting palm up on her thighs. Her skin was an ashen blue-gray, the color of twilight on the moon's horizon, and her hair, matted and filthy though it was, blazed a startling crimson against the monochrome landscape. Her eyes stared forward, unfocused, as if she saw something far beyond the dingy marketplace. "Hey, Vale," a voice called out. It was Dorix, one of the auction overseers, a man whose moral compass pointed reliably toward profit. "You finally in the market for some help up at that hovel of yours?" Herman didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on the woman. "That one's worthless," Dorix said, following Herman's line of sight. "Won't move, won't speak. Barely eats. Temple kind, we think, from the Canis system. They used to be valuable, something about resonance abilities, but this one's broken. Can't even get her to demonstrate basic functions." "What happens to her?" Herman asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could consider why he cared. Dorix shrugged. "Disposal most likely. No point feeding what doesn't work." The woman remained motionless, giving no indication she heard them discussing her fate. "I'll take her," Herman said. Dorix laughed, a harsh sound like metal grinding. "You serious, Vale? She's defective merchandise. Wouldn't make it up the mountain path to your place." "I'll manage. Your credits, your problem," Dorix said, clearly amused by what he perceived as folly. "Actually, tell you what, take her for free. Saves me the disposal fee." A small crowd of workers and traders had gathered, watching the exchange with dark amusement. Herman felt their eyes on him, judging, mocking. He'd spent years avoiding attention, and here he was, inviting it. He approached the woman slowly, kneeling to meet her eye level. Up close, he could see faint markings on her skin, delicate swirls like fossilized ferns pressed into slate. Her eyes were colorless, almost translucent, like ice with depth. "Can you stand?" he asked quietly. No response, no change in her expression. Herman made a decision he couldn't explain, not even to himself. He set down his supplies and carefully slid one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She was alarmingly light, as if her bones were hollow. As he lifted her, her body remained rigid, like a statue. Laughter followed him as he carried her away from the marketplace. Herman felt the woman's heartbeat against his chest, slow and faint, but present. A life, however diminished, however broken. A life someone had decided wasn't worth preserving. He thought of his own life, what remained of it. Was it worth more than hers? By what measure? The trail to Herman's cabin wound 3 kilometers up the mountainside, away from the settlement. It had been an outpost once, before the terraforming project was abandoned. Now, it was just a shell held together by stubbornness and necessity, like its occupant. By the time he reached the cabin, Herman's arms burned with effort, his lungs raw from the thin, cold air. He shouldered open the door and carried the woman inside, setting her gently on his bunk. She remained rigid, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. He lit the stove, set water to boil, and unpacked his supplies, stealing glances at his unexpected guest. What had possessed him? Years of careful isolation, broken on impulse. For what? A lost cause? A dying stranger? Herman knew about lost causes. He knew about dying. He'd come to Cerate to do exactly that, to fade away where no one would notice or care. Yet here he was, brewing tea for a catatonic slave he'd inexplicably rescued. "I don't know what to call you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken aloud to another person in months. "I don't suppose you'll tell me your name." No response. He hadn't expected one. He set a mug of hot tea beside her. "Drink if you want. Don't if you don't. I'm not your master. I'm not anyone's anything." The woman remained motionless as Herman busied himself repairing the heating unit. Night fell quickly on Cerate, the anemic sunlight giving way to penetrating darkness. He worked by lamplight, the old-fashioned kind that burned actual oil, a luxury he rarely indulged. But tonight seemed to warrant it. When he finished his repairs, he made a pallet for himself on the floor, giving his bunk to his silent guest. Before extinguishing the lamp, he looked at her once more. She hadn't moved, hadn't touched the tea. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted to the darkness. "I don't know why I brought you here." Sleep came reluctantly that night, broken by strange dreams of falling ash and scorched stone. Morning arrived with its peculiar grayish light. Herman woke stiff from the hard floor, his breath clouding in the chilled air. It took him a moment to remember he wasn't alone. When he looked to the bunk, he expected to find the woman exactly as he'd left her. She was sitting upright, still unmoving, but her eyes were fixed on him now instead of emptiness. The tea mug sat empty beside her. Progress, Herman supposed. He nodded acknowledgement and went about his morning routine, stoking the stove, melting ice for water, preparing a meager breakfast of reconstituted protein and dried fruit. He set a portion aside for her without comment. Days passed in this strange, silent cohabitation. Herman continued his normal activities, collecting firewood, repairing the cabin's perpetually failing systems, carving small figures from the native bluestone he found on the mountainside. It was a habit from his past life, one he couldn't seem to abandon, though the figures he created now were crude shadows of his former work. The woman remained largely motionless, but Herman began to notice subtle changes. One morning, he found his carved figures rearranged on a shelf. Another day, he returned from gathering wood to find that she had moved from the bunk to the single chair by the window, where pale light fell across her strange, marked skin. She never spoke, never made a sound, but Herman felt her watching him, not with fear or hostility, but with a sort of distant curiosity, as if he were a phenomenon she was trying to understand. On the seventh night, Herman woke from another nightmare, the same one that had haunted him for years. Fire. Screaming. A studio engulfed in flames, his students trapped inside, his hands uselessly beating at locked doors as the heat drove him back. He sat up, gasping, sweat cooling rapidly on his skin in the night air. A soft sound drew his attention to the bunk. The woman was watching him, and in the dull glow of the stove's embers, he saw what might have been concern in her strange, colorless eyes. "Bad dream," he explained hoarsely, though he didn't know why he bothered. "Always the same one." He stood, added wood to the stove, and moved to the cabin's single window. Outside, Sea Raid's barren landscape stretched away under starlight, beautiful in its desolation. "I was a teacher once," he said, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken of his past in years. "Taught sculpture at the University of New Copenhagen. I was good, better than good. Had a waiting list for my master classes." The woman made no response, but he felt her attention on him, unwavering. "There was a fire, a stupid accident, equipment malfunction. I left early that day, had a meeting with gallery owners who wanted to show my work." He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. 5 students died. 5 young people who trusted me to keep them safe, while they learned to create beauty. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft popping of the stove and the eternal sigh of wind across the mountainside. I couldn't face it. The investigations, the funerals, the families. I ran, kept running until I found somewhere so miserable no one would follow. Somewhere I could disappear. He turned to look at her. What about you? What are you running from? For the first time, she moved deliberately in his presence. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those impossible eyes. Then, with visible effort, she opened her mouth and spoke a single word. Why? Her voice was like distant bells, resonant yet fragile. It filled the small cabin, seeming to vibrate in the very walls. Herman stared at her, speechless for a moment. Why what? She gestured vaguely around the cabin, then at him, then at herself. Why did I bring you here? He guessed. A slight nod. Herman sighed and returned to his pallet on the floor. I don't know. Maybe I'm tired of being the only broken thing on this mountain. To his astonishment, the corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Then she closed her eyes, and the conversation, such as it was, ended. The next morning, Herman woke to find her crouched by a shelf of carvings, examining them with careful fingers. When she sensed him watching, she didn't startle or withdraw. Instead, she held up one of the figures, a rough approximation of a bird in flight, and looked at him questioningly. It's not very good, he said, sitting up. I used to be better. Much better. She ran her fingertips over the stone, then tapped her chest. You? Carve. Herman guessed. She shook her head slightly, frustrated. She tapped the stone, then her chest again, more emphatically. The stone? Something about the stone, and you? Her expression showed the first real emotion he'd seen, a flash of intensity that transformed her face. She placed both hands flat on the cabin floor, and, suddenly, Herman felt a subtle vibration. It traveled up through the soles of his feet, resonating in his chest cavity. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, but it was utterly foreign, like hearing music through your bones instead of your ears. Just as quickly it stopped. The woman slumped, her energy visibly depleted by the demonstration. You can feel the stone? Communicate with it somehow? Herman asked, moving to kneel beside her. She nodded weakly. Is that what Doric's meant by resonance abilities? Another nod. She pointed to her throat, then made a gesture like something flowing outward. You used to be able to sing to the stone? Make it sing? Something like that. She closed her eyes briefly, whether in affirmation or exhaustion. Herman couldn't tell. What's your name? He asked gently. She touched her throat again, this time with a grimace. Hurts to speak, he guessed. A slight nod. Let me try, he said. I'll say some sounds, and you tell me when I'm close. Over the next few minutes, through a laborious process, Herman pieced together her name, Syria. Syria, he repeated, testing the sound. I'm Herman. Herman Vale. She nodded once, acknowledging the introduction, then looked pointedly at the crude bird carving still in her hand. You want to try? To carve something? He asked. Syria hesitated, then gave a tentative nod. That afternoon, Herman took her outside for the first time. The weather was marginally better than usual, still bitterly cold, but without the cutting wind that often made outdoor activity impossible. He led her to a sheltered overhang where he had found good carving stone in the past. Syria moved cautiously, her steps uncertain after what had clearly been a long period of immobility. Her prison-issue clothing was woefully inadequate for Sea Raid's climate, so Herman had given her a spare jacket. It engulfed her slender frame, but it was better than nothing. Under the overhang, Herman showed her several chunks of the native bluestone. It's different from earth stone, he explained. More dense, but also more responsive to heat and pressure. Good for detail work if you have the right touch. Syria crouched beside the stone, her strange eyes intent. She reached out hesitantly, then placed her palm flat against the largest piece. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Herman felt it again, that peculiar vibration, like music without sound. The stone beneath her hand seemed to shimmer, though the light hadn't changed. Syria closed her eyes, concentrating. The vibration increased, and Herman watched in astonishment as the surface of the stone began to ripple like water. Then, suddenly she gasped and pulled away. The stone cracked with a sharp report, splitting in two. Herman saw devastation flash across her face. She stared at the broken stone, then at her hands, then back at the stone. A single tear traced down her ashen cheek. "It's all right," Herman said quickly. "First attempts are always rough. I break more pieces than I finish." Syria shook her head vehemently. She touched her chest, then made a shattering gesture with her hands. You're broken," Herman guessed. "Inside." She nodded, more tears following the first. Herman sat beside her, careful not to touch her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Me too," he said simply. They sat in silence for a long time, watching as the weak sunlight shifted across the barren landscape below. Finally, Herman stood and gathered the broken halves of the stone. "Come on," he said. "It's getting colder. We'll try again another day." That night, Syria spoke again. They were eating their meager dinner when she suddenly asked, "What happened?" Herman looked up, surprised. "To me? I told you about the fire." She shook her head and touched her own chest, her expression questioning. "What happened to you?" Herman translated. When she nodded, he sighed. "I don't know. Dorix just said you were temple kind from the Cana system, that you had some kind of resonance ability, but you were broken." Syria considered this, then spoke again, each word clearly requiring effort. "I was temple listener. Sacred stones. Speak through me." "Speak? How?" She gestured helplessly, unable to explain in words what was clearly a complex concept. After a moment's struggle, she simply said, "Taken." Herman understood that much. "Slavers." A short nod. "Long time. Many masters." "Much." She touched her back, where Herman had glimpsed scars beneath her ragged clothing. "They hurt you. To make. Perform. When I could not." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear enough. Herman felt a familiar anger rising in him. The same helpless rage he'd felt watching flames consume his studio. "How long were you with the slavers?" Syria shrugged. "Lost. Counting. Many seasons. And before? You're home." Her expression transformed, a brief glimpse of something like joy breaking through the blankness. "Beautiful. Stone temples. Singing mountains. Family. Clan. All listeners. Do you want to go back?" Herman asked, though he had no idea how such a thing would be possible. Darkness returned to her features. "Cannot. Temple destroyed. Clan taken. Dead now, maybe." Herman nodded, understanding loss all too well. "I'm sorry." Syria studied him with her strange, pale eyes. "Why? Help me." It was the question he'd been asking himself since the marketplace. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm tired of running. Tired of letting destruction have the last word." She seemed to accept this answer, nodding slightly before returning to her meal. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Herman taught Syria basic survival skills for Sea Raid's hostile environment, how to predict weather changes, where to find edible fungi in the cave systems, how to repair the cabin's temperamental heating system. In return, though she spoke rarely, she shared fragments of her culture through gestures and the occasional brief story. Herman learned that her people, whom she called the Lien, had evolved on a moon much like Serade, but with vast networks of crystalline caves. They had developed a symbiotic relationship with the living stone, using their resonance abilities to shape both their environment and their art. The listeners, like Syria, were specially trained from childhood to interpret the subtle vibrations of the sacred stones, translating them into prophecy, history, and song. "Not weapon," she explained one evening, after another failed attempt at carving had left her exhausted. "Never for harm. For connection." Herman understood her frustration. Once, his hands had created beauty with seemingly effortless grace. Now they fumbled with simple tasks, haunted by memories of what they had failed to do when it mattered most. "The ability is still in you," he insisted. "It's just buried. Like mine." Syria shook her head. "Broken," she insisted. "Inside? Shattered." Winter deepened on Serade, the already short days growing even briefer. Herman and Syria spent long hours in the cabin, conserving energy and warmth. Herman continued his carving, producing small, crude figures that nevertheless showed improvement. Syria watched, sometimes attempting to shape the stone with her hands alone, without her resonance. The results were clumsy but earnest. One particularly bitter night, as they huddled near the stove, Syria asked unexpectedly, "Your name?" Herman looked up, confused. "You know my name? Herman Vale." She shook her head. "Before. Artist name." Understanding dawned. "Oh, I didn't use a different name for my art. Just Herman Vale. Famous." He laughed without humor. "For a while. In certain circles. Not anymore. Show me." He hesitated. "I don't have any of my work here." She gestured around the cabin, at his rough carvings. "Different now. Before. Like what?" Herman stared into the stove's flames, seeing instead the clean lines of his studio, the expensive tools, the admiring students. Abstract, mostly. Human forms reduced to essential elements. Movement captured in stillness. He shrugged. "Pretentious, probably." Syria tilted her head. "Miss it. Every day," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But not just the art. The purpose. The feeling that what I created mattered." Syria nodded as if she understood perfectly. Perhaps she did. The first real threat came 3 months after Herman had brought Syria to his cabin. He was returning from supply run to the settlement, already halfway up the mountain path, when he spotted movement near the cabin. Crouching behind an outcropping, he observed 2 men examining the exterior. Their clothing marked them as off-worlders, too well-equipped for casual travelers, too heavily armed for traders. Hunters. Herman's heart raced. He'd heard rumors in the settlement, whispers that certain collectors were offering substantial rewards for specimens of rare abilities. The temple kind from Canis were apparently among the most sought after. He waited until the men moved around to the far side of the cabin, then crept closer. Through the thin walls, he could hear them questioning Syria. Her responses, if any, were too soft to make out. Herman had no weapons beyond a utility knife. The hunters carried pulse rifles and were clearly experienced. Direct confrontation would be suicide. Stealth, then. He circled wide, approaching the cabin from the blind side where a retaining wall created a shadow. He slipped through the secondary entrance, little more than a maintenance hatch, and found himself in the cramped storage space beneath the main floor. Above, he heard one of the hunters growing impatient. "We know what you are," the man said, his voice hard. "Cooperate, and this will be painless. Resist, and we'll take you anyway, just in pieces." Herman eased the access panel open, just enough to see into the main room. Syria stood with her back to the stone wall, her posture not one of fear, but of strange intensity. The hunters faced her, weapons drawn, but not yet aimed. "Last chance," the lead hunter said. "Show us what you can do, and maybe we'll be gentle. My employer pays extra for undamaged specimens." Syria's eyes found Herman's through the narrow opening. A flash of something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or resolve. Then she placed her palms flat against the stone wall behind her and closed her eyes. At first, nothing happened. The hunters exchanged skeptical glances. Then Herman felt it, that familiar vibration, but stronger than he'd ever felt from Syria before. It built rapidly, resonating through the floor, the walls, his very bones. The hunters felt it too. Alarm replaced confidence on their faces as items began to rattle on shelves, as dust sifted from the ceiling. "What is she doing?" one asked nervously. "Shut her down," the leader ordered, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, the vibration changed, focusing into a sound, a deep, sonorous note that seemed to emanate not from Syria, but from the mountain itself. It grew in intensity until Herman had to cover his ears. The hunters did the same, their weapons momentarily forgotten. With a sudden, violent crack, the ground outside the cabin shifted. Through the window, Herman saw an avalanche begin, a controlled cascade of snow and stone tumbling down the path the hunters had used to reach the cabin. Their route was blocked, at least temporarily. The sound ceased. Sirius slumped against the wall, clearly exhausted, but her eyes remained defiant. The lead hunter recovered first, raising his weapon again. Impressive trick. Won't save you. Herman acted without thinking. He burst through the access panel, startling both hunters. In a moment of confusion, he managed to tackle the leader, sending them both crashing into the second hunter. The pulse rifle discharged, blasting a hole in the cabin roof. What followed was a chaotic struggle. Herman was outmatched in every way, but desperation lent him strength. He fought dirty, using everything within reach, a cooking pot, firewood, his bare hands. He took punishing blows, felt ribs crack, tasted blood. Just when it seemed he would be overwhelmed, that strange resonance began again. Syria, barely conscious, had placed her hand on the floor. The vibration built rapidly this time, focusing not outward but inward. The very ground beneath the hunter's feet began to shift, throwing them off balance. "What the hell is this place?" one shouted. The leader made a decision. "Not worth it," he spat, wiping blood from a split lip. "There are easier specimens." They retreated, casting fearful glances at Syria as they stumbled out the door. Herman heard them sliding and cursing their way down the compromised path, clearly spooked by what they'd experienced. When they were gone, he crawled to where Syria had collapsed. Blood trickled from her nose, and her breathing was shallow. "Too much," she whispered. "Used. Wrongly. For harm. You saved us," Herman countered, wincing as he tried to sit up. "You controlled it." She shook her head weakly. "Not control. Desperation." Herman understood. He'd acted out of the same instinct, not skill or courage, but the simple, animal need to protect what mattered. And somewhere in the midst of the fight, he'd realized that Syria mattered to him, not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as a person, perhaps the only person in the galaxy who truly understood what it meant to be hollowed out by loss, yet still somehow standing. They spent the next day tending each other's wounds. Herman had several broken ribs and numerous cuts, and bruises. Syria's injuries were less visible, but perhaps more serious. She remained weak, occasionally trembling as if with fever. "Will they come back?" she asked as Herman reinforced the cabin door. "Maybe. Not soon, though. That avalanche will keep the path blocked until the next thaw. Others will come. Eventually." Herman nodded grimly. "I know." They didn't discuss leaving. Where would they go? The settlement was no safer, possibly less so, with its constant traffic of dubious traders and opportunists. And beyond Serade, Herman had burned those bridges years ago. As for Syria's homeworld, it was half a galaxy away, likely still under the control of whatever forces had destroyed her temple and taken her people. No, they were here, for better or worse. The only question was how they would face what came next. A week after the attack, during another bitter cold spell, Herman found Syria examining the broken halves of the bluestone she had split during her first attempt at carving. "Still want to try?" he asked. She looked up, her strange eyes thoughtful. "Different way," she said. "Not force. Remember." Herman sat beside her. "Remember what?" "Connection. Stone speaks. I listen." She picked up both halves, holding one in each hand. "Broken, yes, but still. Stone." Herman watched as she closed her eyes, holding the stone fragments gently. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, so subtle he almost missed it, a soft hum began to fill the cabin. Not the overwhelming resonance she had used against the hunters, but something gentler, almost musical. The broken edges of the stone began to glow faintly, not with heat, but with a luminescence that seemed to come from within the stone itself. As the glow intensified, Syria brought the two halves together. Where they touched, the light pulsed, then stabilized. When she opened her eyes and removed her hands, the stone remained whole, not perfectly mended, the fracture still visible as a silvery line running through the blue stone, but undeniably a single piece again. Syria looked up at Herman, a tentative smile transforming her face. "Not erased," she said, tracing the silvery line. "Part of stone now. History." Herman understood what she was really saying. The break, the damage, couldn't be undone, but it could be incorporated, acknowledged, even made beautiful in its own way. That night, Herman dreamed of fire again. But this time, instead of helplessly watching the flames consume his studio, he found himself shaping them, directing them, transforming destruction into creation. He woke with the first real sense of peace he'd felt in years. The long winter began to loosen its grip on Serade. The brief days grew incrementally longer, the perpetual twilight occasionally punctuated by actual sunlight. In the settlement below, ships began arriving more frequently as trade routes reopened with the improved weather. Herman and Syria watched these developments from their mountainside vantage point, aware that increased activity brought both opportunity and danger. Their supplies were running critically low. The avalanche had indeed blocked the main path to the cabin, forcing Herman to use a longer, more treacherous route for his infrequent supply runs. Each trip took more out of him than the last. "Must find better way," Syria observed one evening as Herman returned, exhausted and half-frozen, with barely enough supplies to last another week. "I'm open to suggestions," Herman replied, wincing as he removed his boots from frost-numbed feet. Syria was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I have been practicing," she finally said. Herman looked up. "Practicing what?" In answer, she moved to the small shelf where they had placed the mended bluestone. Beside it now sat several more pieces, small but distinct shapes emerging from raw stone. They weren't the crude carvings Herman had been producing, nor were they conventionally sculpted. Instead, they appeared to have grown from the stone itself, guided by some internal logic. Listening again, Syria explained. "Stone wants shape already inside. I just help find." Herman examined the pieces with growing amazement. They were beautiful, abstract forms that somehow suggested familiar elements. A spiral that evoked both water and wind, a vertical piece that captured the essence of Sea Raid's stark mountains. "These are extraordinary," he said honestly. Syria acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. "Can trade, maybe, for supplies?" Herman considered this. The settlement had no real art market. Survival was the priority for most residents. But there were occasionally wealthy traders passing through, bored bureaucrats from the colonial authority, even tourists with more curiosity than sense. "It's worth trying," he agreed. "But I'd have to be careful. If word spreads about your abilities." "Hunters," Syria finished, her expression darkening. "Right." They spent the next few days selecting which pieces might bring the best trade value without drawing too much attention to their creator's unique abilities. Syria continued to work, her confidence growing, though she still tired quickly when using her resonance. Herman found himself watching her work with a mixture of admiration and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. The way her hands moved just above the stone's surface, never quite touching yet somehow shaping. The look of intense concentration that transformed her strange features into something almost luminous. The small smile of satisfaction when the stone revealed its hidden form. He realized he was starting to see beauty again, not just in Syria's work, but in the harsh landscape outside, in the play of light through ice crystals, in the resilience of life on this unforgiving moon. It had been so long since he'd noticed such things that the awareness was almost painful, like blood returning to a numbed limb. The morning Herman was to leave for the settlement with their trade goods, he found Syria outside the cabin, standing motionless in the pale sunlight. She wore his spare coat, now modified to better fit her slender frame, and had wrapped a scarf around her distinctive hair. From a distance, she might pass for human, a thought that brought both relief and a strange pang of what might have been loss. "Safe journey," she said as he approached with his pack. Herman nodded. "I shouldn't be gone more than a day. Stay inside, stay quiet, always," she replied with the ghost of a smile. He hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave her, even for a day. "Syria," she tilted her head questioningly. He faltered, unsure what he even wanted to say. "Be careful." Her expression softened. "You also." The trip down took longer than usual due to the compromise path. By the time Herman reached the settlement, a supply ship had docked, perfect timing for his trading mission. The marketplace was busier than he'd seen it in months, with off-worlders mingling among the settlers. Herman moved cautiously through the crowd, his pack of stone pieces secured against his side. He'd wrapped each in cloth, partly for protection, partly to conceal their nature until he found the right buyer. He spotted a well-dressed woman examining goods at a luxury stall. Rare earth textiles, preserved foods, the kind of items only the wealthy could afford on Serade. Herman approached carefully, selecting one of the simpler pieces from his pack. "Interested in local art?" he asked, unwrapping just enough to show the polished blue surface. The woman glanced at him, then did a double take at the stone. "That's Serade bluestone, isn't it? I didn't think anyone was working with it." "Few are," Herman acknowledged. "It's temperamental." She held out her hand. "May I?" He hesitated, then placed the small sculpture in her palm. It was the spiral form, its curves capturing something of water's fluid motion despite being solid stone. The woman turned it in the light, her expression shifting from casual interest to genuine appreciation. "This is remarkable work. The internal luminescence. I've never seen bluestone manipulated this way." Herman said nothing, letting the piece speak for itself. "Are you the artist?" she asked. A necessary lie. "Yes. Do you have more?" He revealed 2 additional pieces, careful to select those that showed the least evidence of Syria's unique abilities. The woman examined each with growing enthusiasm. "I'll take all 3, she declared. "Name your price." Herman named a sum that would cover their supplies for months. To his surprise, the woman agreed without haggling, quickly transferring the credits to his account. As she carefully packed her purchases, she asked, "Do you have a studio in the settlement? I'd like to see more of your work before I leave." "No studio," Herman said quickly. "I work privately." The woman smiled. "A reclusive artist. How intriguing. Well, I'll be on Serade for another 3 days. If you decide to show more of your work, ask for Marincask at the colonial offices. I'm always looking for unique pieces." Herman thanked her and retreated, unsettled by the interaction despite its success. He completed his supply purchases quickly, selecting more substantial provisions than usual with his newfound wealth. As he was preparing to leave, a commotion near the landing area caught his attention. A new ship had docked, smaller than the supply vessel, with the sleek lines of a private craft. Its hull bore the insignia of the Collectors Guild, an organization ostensibly dedicated to preserving cultural artifacts, but rumored to deal in less savory acquisitions, including, some said, living specimens of rare abilities. Herman melted into the crowd, watching as a tall figure disembarked, a man in expensive clothing with the bearing of authority. He spoke briefly with settlement officials, then produced what appeared to be images or documents. Herman caught a glimpse of red, like flame, hair the color of fire. Syria. Fear clutched at Herman's chest. He retreated further, calculating his options. The main path to his cabin was blocked, but the collector wouldn't know that. However, if he had tracking equipment or hired local guides who knew the mountain, Herman needed to warn Syria. He needed to get back to the cabin. But rushing out now, heavily laden with supplies, would only draw attention. He forced himself to wait, to move casually toward the settlement's edge, all while keeping the collector in his peripheral vision. The man was methodical, showing his images to various settlers, likely offering rewards for information. Some shook their heads, others pointed toward the mountain, Herman's mountain. When he judged it safe, Herman slipped away, taking a circuitous route to confuse any potential followers. The journey back was agonizing, his body screaming for rest while his mind raced with worry. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen, and he was nearly delirious with exhaustion. Syria met him at the door, her expression changing from welcome to alarm as she took in his condition. "What happened?" Between labored breaths, Herman explained about the collector. "They're looking specifically for you," he concluded. "The red hair. They must have descriptions from the slavers." Syria absorbed this news with remarkable calm. "We knew they would come." "Not so soon," Herman said, distress evident in his voice. "Not with so much resources. This isn't some opportunistic hunter. This is organized. Syria helped him to the chair, then began unpacking the supplies with efficient movements. Options. Herman ran a hand over his face. We could run. There are other settlements on Serate, more remote than this one. Same problem, different place, Syria observed. We could try to leave the moon entirely. With the credits from your art, we might afford passage on a cargo ship. To where? Your world hunts me. My world. She trailed off, the implication clear. Her home no longer existed as she had known it. Herman had no answer. They worked in silence, storing the new supplies, preparing a simple meal. The cabin seemed smaller than ever, more vulnerable. Yet it was the only home they had. Later, as they sat by the stove's dwindling light, Syria asked softly, "My art. Good price." Herman nodded. "More than I expected." The buyer was impressed. "Wanted to see more." "Dangerous?" "Maybe. I didn't tell her anything about you." Syria considered this. "Could sell more. Enough for ship. But then, always running." "Yes," Herman admitted. "Always looking over our shoulders. Always afraid." Like now. He couldn't argue with that. They were already living in fear, already hiding. The only difference would be the scenery. "What do you want, Syria?" he asked finally. "If you could choose, what would you want?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was soft but certain. "Home. Your temple. Your clan." She shook her head. "Gone. But home. Feeling. Safety. Purpose." She gestured around the crude cabin. "Here. Becoming home. With you. Purpose again." Herman felt something in his chest tighten. Even with the danger? The isolation? "Danger everywhere," she said simply. "Isolation. Choice." He understood what she meant. On Serate, they lived a precarious existence, but it was one they had some control over. They had built something here, not just physical shelter, but a kind of sanctuary for their wounded spirits. If they fled, they would be starting over from nothing, with no guarantee of finding better circumstances. "So we stay," Herman said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "We make a stand here." Syria nodded, then added, "Make home stronger." Over the next days, they worked tirelessly to reinforce their position. Herman set primitive alarms along all approaches to the cabin. Tripwires connected to clattering cans, pressure plates that would trigger falling debris. Syria used her growing mastery of resonance to sense vibrations from farther down the mountain, giving them early warning of anyone's approach. Together, they created a hidden cache in the cave system behind the cabin, stocked with emergency supplies and Syria's most precious stone pieces. If they needed to retreat, they would have somewhere to go. Meanwhile, Syria continued to create, her work growing more confident, more intentional. She and Herman started a larger project together, a stone marker for the cliff face overlooking the settlement. It would be visible from below, a declaration of sorts, though its meaning would be clear only to them. The work brought them closer. Herman found himself sharing more about his past, not just the tragedy, but the joy that had preceded it. His early struggles as an artist, his first successful exhibition, the satisfaction of teaching. In turn, Syria revealed more about her people there. Customs, the intricate relationship between the Lien and their living stones. One evening, as they worked side by side on the marker, Herman realized that the constant gnawing guilt that had driven him to Serate had subsided. Not disappeared. It would always be part of him, like the silvery crack in Syria's mended stone, but it no longer defined him entirely. "You're quiet," Syria observed, her speech having grown more fluid with practice. "Just thinking," Herman replied, "about when I came here. How empty I was." She nodded understanding. "Like me, when you found me. We both changed." Syria traced the whorls in the stone before them. "Still broken," she said, "but useful broken." Herman smiled at the apt description. "Useful broken. I like that." The marker they were creating wasn't figurative in any conventional sense, yet somehow it captured their shared experience. A representation of two fragmented beings finding wholeness not despite their brokenness, but through it. The fracture lines were incorporated into the design, channels for light rather than weaknesses. As they worked, Herman found himself watching Syria more and more. The concentration in her strange eyes, the graceful movements of her hands above the stone, the occasional small smile when a particularly challenging section came together. He realized, with a sense of both wonder and trepidation, that he had come to love her, not just as a companion in adversity, but as a woman, a being of remarkable resilience and depth. He said nothing of these feelings. There would be time, perhaps, when their situation was more secure. Or perhaps not. Either way, what mattered was the present, the work they shared, the sanctuary they were building, the trust between them. 5 days after Herman's trip to the settlement, they spotted movement on the lower mountain path. 3 figures, moving with the deliberate pace of those who know their destination. One tall, the collector, and 2 others with the unmistakable bearing of professional security. "They come," Sirius said simply, setting aside her carving tools. Herman nodded grimly. "Sooner than I'd hoped. Are you ready?" She met his eyes steadily. Yes. They had discussed their plan many times. When the collector and his men reached the first alarm, Herman and Syria would retreat to their hidden cache in the caves. From there, they would have options, wait out the search, escape along the higher ridges if necessary, or even confront their pursuers from a position of advantage. What they would not do was run blindly or separate. Whatever came, they would face it together. The wait was excruciating. Herman packed the last essential supplies, while Syria used her resonance to track the approaching group. Their progress was slow due to the damaged path, but steady. Professionals, not easily deterred. Close to first alarm, Syria reported as the sun dipped toward the horizon. 1 hour, maybe less. Herman secured their packs. "We should move to the cave now. Be settled before they trigger the alarm." Syria nodded agreement, but as she stood to leave, she suddenly stiffened. "Wait, something else." "What?" "More men." She closed her eyes, concentrating. "No. Ship. Coming fast." Herman moved to the window, scanning the darkening sky. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a glint of metal caught the fading sunlight. A small craft approaching rapidly from the direction opposite the settlement. "Could be reinforcements for the collector," Herman said, tension evident in his voice. "No. Different. Feeling." Syria cocked her head, listening to vibrations only she could sense. "Looking. For us. But not like hunters." Before Herman could question her further, the craft came into clear view. It was a sleek, single-pilot vessel with no visible markings. It circled once overhead, then descended toward a relatively flat area about 100 meters from the cabin. "We need to go," Herman urged. "Now, while we're between them." Syria hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Wait," she insisted, moving to the door. "Syria, we don't know who that is." She looked back at him, her strange eyes luminous in the cabin's dim light. "Trust me, please." Against his better judgment, Herman nodded. They watched from the doorway as the craft's hatch opened and a single figure emerged. From this distance, details were hard to discern, but the figure was slender and moved with unusual grace. As it approached, Herman saw that it wore clothing similar to Syria's original garments, the simple robes of temple kind. Syria stepped forward, a small, strangled sound escaping her throat. The approaching figure paused, then quickened its pace. As it came closer, Herman saw that its skin had the same blue-gray tone as Syria's, though its hair was silver rather than flame red. "Ayara," Syria whispered, the name carrying a weight of disbelief. The newcomer stopped a few paces away, gazing at Syria with an expression of wonder that mirrored her own. "Sister listener," she said in that same resonant voice Herman had come to associate with Syria. "You live." What followed was a rapid exchange in a language Herman didn't understand, musical and full of subtle modulations. Syria's whole being seemed transformed, animated by joy and shock in equal measure. She gestured frequently toward Herman, explaining something that caused Ayara to study him with newfound interest. Finally, Syria turned to him, her eyes bright with emotion. "Herman, this is Ayara, senior listener from Northern Temple." They thought all Temple kind lost or taken, have been searching, finding scattered survivors. Herman nodded acknowledgement to the newcomer. I'm glad you found each other, but we have an urgent problem. There are hunters on the mountain, less than an hour away. Ayara's expression hardened. The collector. Yes, we know of him. His ship was tracked to this moon. That is how he found you. We? Herman asked. Resistance, Syria explained. Against slavers. Many peoples working together. Ayara nodded. The Collectors Guild has overreached. Their hunger for rare abilities has united those they would hunt. We have allies now, in colonial authority, in trading guilds, even in settled worlds like yours, Herman Vale. The use of his full name startled Herman. You know who I am? A small smile touched Ayara's lips. We make point to know who helps our kind. A specially famous sculptor who disappeared after tragic fire. Herman felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. That life is over. Perhaps, Ayara acknowledged. Or perhaps new life includes parts of old. Like good stonework, what is removed shapes what remains. The philosophical observation was interrupted by a distant sound, the clatter of their first alarm being triggered. They come, Sirius said unnecessarily. Ayara glanced toward the lower path. My ship can take 3. We go now. Join others. Safety in numbers, in organization. Herman looked at Syria, seeing the conflict in her eyes. This was rescue, a chance to rejoin her people, to be part of something larger than their precarious existence on this remote mountainside. Yet he also saw reluctance, hesitation. Go, he said gently. This is what you've wanted, to find your people again. Syria shook her head vehemently. Not without you. I would only complicate things. I'm not. You are, she interrupted, taking his hand. My people. My home now. She turned to Ayara. Both or neither. Ayara studied them, her expression unreadable. Then, to Herman's surprise, she laughed, a sound like water over stone. Stubborn always, even as child. She gestured toward her ship. 3, I said. Come or stay, your choice. But choose quickly. Herman looked back at the cabin, the crude shelter that had somehow become home over these strange, transformative months. At the marker stone they had created together, still unfinished. At the mountain that had witnessed their slow, painful rebirth. We stay, he said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. Beside him, Syria nodded firmly. We stay. Ayara's eyebrows rose. Hunters come. Collector will not stop. Why stay? Because this is ours, Herman explained, gesturing to the cabin, the stone marker, the mountain itself. We built this. We found ourselves here. Running now would mean starting over again. And we're tired of running, Syria added. From past. From pain. Understanding dawned in Ayara's eyes. Not just shelter. Sanctuary. She nodded slowly. Then we must make sanctuary stronger. She reached into her robes and produced a small communication device. Take this. Connected to Resistance Network. When you need help, it will come. And the collector? Herman asked, glancing toward the path where the alarms had sounded. Ayara smiled, a predatory expression that transformed her serene features. Let me worry about collector. Been tracking his kind too long to miss opportunity. She spoke rapidly to Syria in their musical language, clasped her sister listener's hands briefly, then nodded respectfully to Herman. We will meet again, she promised. Until then, listen well to stones. They remember what we forget. With that cryptic statement, she retreated to her ship. As it lifted off, Herman saw it angle not away from the mountain, but toward the lower path where the collector and his men were making their ascent. What will she do? He asked. Syria's expression was grim satisfaction. Justice, I think. They never learned exactly what transpired on the path that night. Through Syria's resonance abilities, they felt vibrations that might have been weapons fire, followed by the distinctive hum of a ship's engines departing. Later, when they cautiously investigated, they found signs of a confrontation, but no bodies, no blood, just abandoned equipment and deeply scored earth where something had landed forcibly. In the settlement below, rumors spread of the notorious collector's disappearance, along with his security team. Some said they'd been ambushed by rival hunters. Others claimed the colonial authority had finally moved against the Collectors Guild's more questionable practices. No one connected the events to the reclusive sculptor and his strange companion on the mountainside. Spring came to Serade. As much as any season could be called spring on that perpetually twilight moon. The days lengthened marginally, and in protected valleys, hardy native vegetation emerged from dormancy. Herman and Syria completed their marker stone, setting it where it could be seen from the settlement below, not as a challenge, but as a declaration. We are here. This is ours. Occasionally, they made careful trips to trade Syria's increasingly sophisticated stone creations. Her work had developed a small but devoted following among certain collectors. Ironic, given their previous experiences, but these were legitimate art enthusiasts, not hunters of abilities. Herman acted as her representative, never revealing the artist's identity or location. They used the proceeds to improve their cabin, adding better insulation, a more reliable heating system, even a small greenhouse where they cultivated both earth plants and native Serade species. They were not wealthy by any conventional standard, but they were comfortable, secure in ways that went beyond material provisions. The communication device Ayara had left remained silent for months, then activated one day with a simple message: network growing. Safe houses established on 7 worlds. Your sanctuary added to map. Assistance available if needed. They discussed whether to reply, ultimately sending a brief acknowledgement. Sanctuary open to those who need it. And so they became, in their small way, part of something larger, a network of resistance against exploitation, of refuge for the hunted. Occasionally, a ship would appear over the mountain, bringing a tired traveler or two seeking temporary shelter. Sometimes these visitors were temple kind, like Syria, sometimes other species with their own unique abilities and burdens. Herman and Syria welcomed them all, offering what they had learned about healing, about reforging purpose from the fragments of shattered lives. Between these visits, they continued their work. Herman returned to Syria's sculpting for the first time since the fire, finding that his hands remembered more than he'd thought possible. His style had changed, less abstract, more rooted in the raw beauty of survival, but the essential joy of creation had returned. He began teaching again, one student at a time, those who found their way to the sanctuary and showed interest in learning. Syria's resonance abilities continued to develop, not to their original state, but to something new, a deeper, more intuitive understanding of stone and vibration. She could create works of astonishing beauty and complexity, pieces that seemed alive with captured sound and emotion. More importantly, she found ways to teach aspects of her gift to others, even those not born with temple-kind abilities. Together, they explored the mountains beyond their cabin, discovering cave systems that responded to Syria's resonance in unexpected ways. In one such cave, they established a true sanctuary, a place of stone and sound where the wounded could come to heal, where the hunted could find respite, where broken things might discover they still had value. And on quiet evenings, when no visitors claimed their attention, Herman and Syria would sit together on the cliff edge, watching the slow wheel of stars above Sirade's bleak but no longer desolate landscape. Sometimes they would speak of the past, not with the raw pain of their early days, but with the perspective of those who have incorporated their scars into a new wholeness. More often, they would simply sit in companionable silence, their shoulders touching, their breath synchronizing in the thin, cold air. On one such evening, as the settlement lights glimmered far below like earthbound stars, Syria asked a question she had never voiced before. Regret? Finding me? Herman considered this seriously, as he did all her questions. No, he said finally. Not for a moment. Even with danger? Complications? He smiled, taking her hand, the blue-gray fingers now familiar and dear against his human skin. Especially because of those. They forced me to choose living over merely surviving. She nodded, understanding the distinction. Worthless things, she mused, often most valuable. Not worthless. Herman corrected gently. Just valued differently, by different measures. Syria leaned against him, her warmth a contrast to the eternal chill of Serade. Like us, he agreed. Below them, the settlement continued its bustling commerce, its relentless commodification of all things, including life itself. But up here on their mountainside, Herman and Syria had created something commerce couldn't quantify, a resonance between broken pieces that together formed a new kind of wholeness. Not perfect, not unmarked, but enduring. A harmony that, once found, could not be lost again. The wind picked up, carrying the faint crystalline sound of ice forming on the distant peaks. Syria tilted her head, listening to vibrations only she could fully perceive. Then she smiled, that rare, transformative expression that never failed to remind Herman how fortunate he had been that day in the marketplace when he had seen value where others saw only wreckage. "Storm coming," she said, "but cabin strong now." Herman nodded, rising and offering his hand to help her up. "Yes," he agreed, looking at their home, their sanctuary, their shared creation. Strong enough. They walked back together, two silhouettes against the vast, indifferent beauty of Sea Raid's twilight. Not the last beings left behind, but the first of something new.